Palestinian. And Israel needs to understand the importance of living together without humiliation, living as equals. And the future of Israel and the well-being of Israel, is a question mark under the present circumstances. Israel occupies the territory of others in violation of an endless number of UN General Assembly resolutions. The government declares that democratically elected Hamas in Gaza is a terrorist entity. As a result, they cannot expect to find much cooperation in return from the Arab-Palestinian community, both within and external to the occupied territories. What Israel gets back in return is defensive military aggression. That is, resistance, as permitted under international law, by those under foreign military occupation. Nonetheless, this resistance results in unacceptable civilian deaths, and such deaths occurring in Israel are proportionally minute. However, you will agree that even one child murdered is one child too many. If Israel wants to move forward towards peaceful coexistence, and I have always assumed that she does, despite certain Zionist ambitions for a greater Israel, the occupation of land taken in 1967 must end. And it must end without conditions, without humiliation, and without settlements, without divisive walls and exclusive highways, and without the other signs of apartheid of which Jimmy Carter rightly speaks. And negotiations cannot be based on Israel handing back illegally held real estate since 1967 in exchange for a legitimate Palestinian space and rights under law, including the right of return. When Hamas is omitted from the peace process, failure is assured, just as would have been the case had the armed IRA been excluded from the peace dialogue in Northern Ireland. And as peace is postponed, 20 years or so since the Oslo dialogues, the West Bank settlements increase and grow. Now, I've mentioned the assumption of an Israeli desire for peace, but I must tell you that this assumption was somewhat shattered a couple of weeks ago in Galway University at a debate of the Literary and Debating Society. When a moderate fellow Israeli panelist announced that he considered me to be naive. His perspective is that for most Israelis, there is no incentive for peace, because they are comfortable, not well informed, simply disinterested. The Palestinians are irrelevant to their lives and their prosperity. Living the good life, what happens in Gaza or the West Bank or even in East Jerusalem does not really impact. Despite having served in the IDF, the Israeli Defense Force, they've forgotten the explosive reality of Palestinian suffering under occupation and have dismissed global concerns thereof, even perhaps celebrate Israeli pariah status in the world as though that was something to be proud of. I find it astonishing. I think I also find it frightening. We know there are Israeli peace activists at work. We know, just recently, in fact last night, I was in London at the Gandhi Foundation speaking on a similar subject when the Gandhi Peace Prize was awarded to an NGO called Parents Circle Families Forum. This is an extraordinary group of Israelis and Palestinians who are bereaved. They've all lost loved ones, fathers or daughters or sons or uncles or brothers or sisters. And they come together to empathize with each other first, to understand where each one is coming from in their particular case. And then they bring together young people, particularly teenagers, in the schools of Israel and in the West Bank, and to get them to understand each other, the other community, and from whence they're coming. In a process to try to get a greater understanding of why Israel the way she is, and why the Palestinians feel the way they do. Very interesting process. So we know there's really good work going on, and you're going to hear more of that tonight from Mairead and Barbara, I believe. However, negotiations for a peaceful Palestinian-Israeli existence can no longer, it seems to me, be dominated by the United States. They are, in theory, an honest broker. We know that is really nonsense. The USA is not an honest broker. Washington has played games with the strategic presence of Israel for a long time, since the beginning, because it happens to be next door, of course, to the essential oil reserves of the United States, which, as many Americans see it, lie for some reason under Arab sand. And because of domestic politics, which tends to drive, as you all well know, foreign policy. The US Congress itself is manipulated by the Israeli lobby, AIPAC, and the political influence of the Orthodox and more quiet, secular Jewish communities in New York, where I normally live, they all have a very important role. The peculiar politics of the red state Christian Zionists, which some of you may be familiar with, I would call them the Rapture Group, have also played into the hands of Israeli dominance in DC foreign policy decisions and discussions. PNAC, which is the Project for the New American Century, and its dangerous overview and vision of empire also cannot be forgotten. And as Mr. Obama discovered on Tuesday, the United States is not run out of the White House. It's run by the military-industrial, media and energy complex, which Mr. Eisenhower introduced in '61, but I've expanded it, as you just seen. Now, I believe that it's time, in fact, for the neighborhood of Israel and Palestine to get involved. And I think particularly that applies to Turkey and to Egypt. They're both allies of the United States, and they're of the region. They both recognize Israel. They have much to offer Israel in addition to trade and tourism. They have a history and an ancient presence, and they have a vested interest in peace. And maybe they convince Israel that peace, in fact, would serve the best interests of the Jews and Jewish people residing in the country. Worldwide, however, the abuse of the term terrorist has created abuse of law, as conspicuously witnessed after 9/11. By pointing the finger of terrorism at others, the Western democracies and other states, including Israel, remove the protection of human rights, the Human Rights Convention, the Geneva Conventions, humanitarian law. The so-called terrorists, as non-state actors, are murdered, tortured, and detained indefinitely, often without charge, for very long periods of time, as we've seen in Guantanamo Bay. People I'm sure some of you have met, and I've met, out of Guantanamo Bay. Tens of thousands at the moment of Palestinians are being held in Israeli prisons, while disappearances and assassinations are frequent. And humanitarian law, you know, was established to protect individuals, to protect freedom fighters and their civilian supporters from state war crimes, such as the world witnessed in Cast Lead, the horrific Israeli military massacres in Gaza. States do not punish themselves or their military. Thus, international law must endeavour to do so. However, the objectivity of the Goldstone report, for example, on Cast Lead was immediately questioned by Israel and, of course, by Washington. And the United Nations stumbled yet again. And just the other day I read, and perhaps you did also, that the Israeli military advocate general said, just last week actually, we are being scrutinized at a time when we, as an army and a country, are living under a moral blockade. Following the Goldstone report on Gaza and the interception of the aid flotilla to Gaza. That is an interesting view from inside the IDF itself. Now, those who care, and that probably includes everybody in this room, those who care cannot allow the legitimate struggle against the military occupation of Palestine to be brushed aside by those shouting terrorist. In fact, it is Israeli killing of large numbers of women and children in Gaza, just like the US attack on Baghdad, known as shock and awe. That constitutes terrorism. These are the rogue states in terms of international law, and we of the EU and those of the NATO, and particularly the UK, are not far behind. We, of course, apply double standards as it suits our own interests. And particularly relevant, I don't know why it's so hot in this place. It's like the Middle East. Particularly relevant to this idea of double standards, which crops up in all aspects of the United Nations and the Security Council and the work it does. What is relevant is the Persian poet Omar Khayyam. And he said,